The
This
sterling
timeless
showroom in
classic is ready
downtown
to
Los
redefine
Angeles
luxury.
glowed under 1,000 white
No,
lights.
not now.
It's not
Marble
starting.
floors stretched
There must
beneath
be a
polished
glitch.
glass walls,
So,
reflecting
this is the car you
investors,
wouldn't sell.
journalists,
I
and
can see why.
collectors who had
It's
paid
almost as
handsomely to
charming as
stand
you.
inside the building
But I bet
that
mine's
night.
faster.
The air smelled of leather, brushed
Sir,
steel,
you and the child need to
perfume.
leave now.
At the center
okay,
of the
sweetie.
platform,
We're
beneath
going.
a single beam
This
of
is
overhead light,
unnecessary.
sat the Sterling
please,
Raven
it's policy.
512, a long-bodied coupe in silver-black lacquer that had not turned over in
Daddy,
18
wait.
years.
Don't leave me.
Vivian Sterling stood beside it in a black bodycon dress, the V neckline cut deep, her honey brown hair falling smoothly past her shoulders.
I'm doing this for my daughter.
She had rehearsed this moment
not
for
for your
3
teasing
months.
promise.
The Raven was her father's favorite, the last car he had ever driven, and she had built the entire gala around the promise that it would roar to life again tonight in front of every investor who still doubted whether she could carry his name forward. She lifted the microphone and gave the signal. A young engineer turned the key. The first attempt produced only a dry click. The second brought a flutter of dashboard lights that died as quickly as they bloomed. By the third try, the cabin sat in silence so heavy that the crystal chandeliers above seemed to hum with embarrassment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clinton Avery, the 60-year-old investor whose $90 million fund could either save the Sterling brand or seal its grave, glanced at his watch. Behind him, William Crawford, the 52-year-old board member who had spent 2 years quietly engineering Vivian's downfall, allowed himself a thin smile. Near the edge of the stage, half hidden behind a velvet rope, a tall man in a faded denim shirt stood with one hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder. Elias Walker had not been invited as a guest. He had been hired for the day, paid a flat fee to help move vehicles between the loading dock and the platform. His boots were scuffed. His hands carried the faint, permanent dark of engine grease that no soap had ever fully erased. Beside him, 6-year-old Matilda Walker held her small silver toy car against her chest like a charm. When the third attempt failed, Elias tilted his head a fraction of an inch and spoke under his breath, more to himself than to anyone nearby. "That isn't a dead engine. It's locked out of sequence." Vivian heard him. In a calmer moment she might have asked what he meant. But standing under those lights with William smirking and Clinton checking his watch, she did the one thing her father had warned her never to do. She used pride as a shield. She turned toward the stranger in denim, took 2 slow steps off the platform, and let her voice carry across the marble. "Start the engine," she said, smiling without warmth, "and I'll date you." The room laughed. It started as a single startled chuckle near the bar and spread outward like a dropped glass shattering across a quiet floor. A reporter near the press line began typing immediately. Elias did not answer. He did not move. He only lowered his hand to cover Matilda's small ear, the way a father shields a child from a passing siren. But Matilda had already heard it, and her grip on her silver toy car tightened until her knuckles went white. Years before that gala, in a small town outside Bend, Oregon, Elias Walker had grown up inside his father's garage, learning the language of older machines the way other children learned songs. By the time he was 12, he could distinguish a misfiring valve from a weak fuel pump by sound alone. By 20, restoration shops as far away as Reno were calling him. He had no engineering degree. He had something rarer. He had patience for things other people had given up on. He met Sarah Walker at a county fair when he was 23. She was a second-grade teacher with a laugh that softened the rough edges of his shop floor years. "Your daddy doesn't fix cars with his hands," she would whisper to Matilda. "He fixes them by listening." Matilda was 4 when a rain-slicked highway took her mother away on a Tuesday evening drive home from a parent-teacher conference. After that night, the garage went quiet for almost a year. Elias kept working, but the offers from far-off shops, the contracts that would have moved his career forward, all required travel he could no longer afford. He turned them down one by one. He chose, instead, the unglamorous work of a roving mechanic. He fixed delivery trucks and farm generators for people who paid him in cash. The pay was modest. But he could pick Matilda up from school, pack her lunch every morning, and read at the edge of her bed every night until her eyes finally closed, and that, to him, was worth every promotion he had let pass. Matilda kept the small silver toy car her mother had given her 2 days before the accident. It was a die-cast model of a vintage coupe, worn smooth at the wheels from being held so often. When Matilda missed her mother, she rolled it across the kitchen table and asked Elias the same question every time. "Do you think Mom will know if I see a real one someday?" That was why Elias had taken the gala job at all. The pay was barely worth a tank of gas. But the listing had mentioned vintage automobiles on display, and he had thought only for a moment that Matilda might finally see one of the silver coupes she loved. He had not expected a microphone. He had certainly not expected a woman in a black dress to ask him in front of 200 people to start an engine in exchange for a date. And Matilda, who had been so excited that morning that she had eaten her cereal in 3 minutes flat, was now staring at the marble floor, trying very hard not to cry. Vivian Sterling had not always been cold. Her father, Henry Sterling, had been a quiet legend in vintage performance restoration. He had built Sterling Motors Heritage from a two-bay shop in Long Beach into a name spoken with reverence at concours events. He died of a heart attack in his own driveway, 2 days after Vivian's 10th birthday, and the company had been adrift ever since. By the time Vivian inherited the title of chief executive at 26, Sterling Heritage was bleeding. The market had shifted toward electric collectibles. William Crawford had spent 2 years assembling a coalition of older directors who believed Vivian was, as he liked to phrase it in private meetings, a sentimental heiress playing with her father's tools. The Avery deal was supposed to silence them all. $90 million in growth capital, a network of museum partners, access to the international collector circuit. But Clinton Avery had made his terms plain in their first meeting 6 months earlier. Sterling Heritage would receive his money only if the company could prove, publicly, that it still possessed the craft to bring its own legends back to life. Stories were not enough. He wanted to hear an engine. So Vivian had chosen the Raven V12 Tart, the car her father had loved most, the car that had not run since the morning he died. She had not told the board that the restoration team, despite 3 months of effort, had been unable to coax the Raven back into starting. She had told herself that on the night of the gala, with the right pressure and the right specialist on standby, it would all come together. It had not. When Elias spoke from the edge of the stage, Vivian was already in free fall. She heard William's quiet, satisfied breath behind her. She saw the shift in Clinton's face, the small recalculation that any seasoned investor performs before politely excusing himself from a deal. She did not look at Elias and see a man with skill. She looked at him and saw a witness, a stranger who had heard her fail. And in that single second of panic, she chose mockery over honesty. William stepped close enough that only she could hear him. "If that car doesn't run in 5 minutes," he murmured, "you should be ready to sign the sale papers tonight." In the moments after Vivian's challenge, the gala turned cruel in the practiced, well-mannered way that wealthy rooms turn cruel. A young man near the press line laughed loudly, looking for approval. A woman in pearls whispered to her companion, and they both grinned. An engineer near the rear of the stage muttered, just loud enough to carry. 3 teams of specialists couldn't find the fault. "What's a part-timer going to do?" Carter Briggs, the head of floor security, had already begun moving. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of professionally polite hostility that long careers in luxury venues teach. He stopped 2 feet from Elias and looked at Matilda the way one looks at a smudge on a clean window. "Your shift is over," Carter said. "Take the kid out before she gets in the way of the program." It was a small sentence, but it landed like a slap. Matilda flinched. She had done nothing wrong. She had only stood beside her father, holding her toy car, watching grown-ups in beautiful clothes ignore him. But in the geometry of that room, she and her father were the wrong shape. They did not belong, and Carter had been hired in part to make sure that wrongness was kept neatly off the platform. Elias crouched and adjusted the collar of Matilda's coat. He did not look at Carter. He spoke only to his daughter, in a voice as soft as the coat itself. "It is all right, sweetheart. We can go." He had been through rooms like this before. Every man who works long enough in a service trade learns there are houses where the help is invisible until something breaks, and then invisible again the moment it is fixed. He had learned to leave such places without losing himself, but Matilda had not learned that yet, and Elias was in no hurry to teach her. He took her hand and turned toward the side exit. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of mild embarrassment, the way a polite audience parts when an unfortunate guest is being escorted out. Vivian, watching this, felt the first cold prick of doubt under her ribcage. She saw the child's face. She saw the man's restraint. And because she could not bear the sight of her own reflection in either of them, she did the worst thing a person can do in such a moment. She doubled down. "If you really start that engine," she called after him, her voice bright and theatrical for the cameras, "I'll keep my word. Dinner.ui. A date." In front of everyone in this room. The laughter rose again. It was meant to be charming. It was not. Elias paused mid-step. He turned his head just enough to catch her eye over his shoulder. There was no anger in his expression. There was something quieter and far more dangerous. There was understanding. He saw in that instant that Vivian Sterling was not mocking him alone. She was, without realizing it, teaching his daughter that men who work with their hands deserve to be laughed at. He squeezed Matilda's small fingers and kept walking. But Matilda did not walk. She stopped 3 steps from the edge of the platform and would not be moved. Her grip on her toy car had gone fierce. Her eyes, which had filled but not spilled, lifted from the marble floor to the silver-black coupe at the center of the stage. Then they lifted to her father's face. When she spoke very quietly, the way children do when they are afraid the words might break something fragile. "Daddy, Mom said you could fix anything." Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He had not heard those words spoken aloud in 2 years. He had heard them in his own mind 1,000 times, in Sarah's voice, on nights when he was tired, and the bills were thin, and the future seemed to consist only of the next oil change and the next school lunch. But hearing them now from his daughter's mouth, in this room under these lights, was something else entirely. Sarah had told Matilda that the night before the accident. Elias remembered. He had been kneeling beside an old Buick the shop had written off, and Sarah had stood in the doorway holding Matilda on her hip. She had said it the way she said everything, with quiet certainty, as if it were already a settled fact of the world. If Elias walked out of the showroom now, he was not wrong. Any reasonable man would walk. But Matilda would learn that when other people laugh at you, the safe choice is to leave, even when you know the truth and they do not. She would carry that lesson into every classroom and every interview for the rest of her life. He could not let his daughter inherit that. He turned around. The crowd's laughter had not yet fully faded. A few faces near the front were still smirking. Vivian stood with her arms folded across the bodice of her dress, performing composure for the cameras. William Crawford was already beginning to angle himself toward Clinton Avery to repair the damage. Elias walked back toward the platform, slowly, deliberately, with Matilda's small hand in his. He stopped 3 feet from Vivian. "I will try," he said. His voice was not loud, but the room had grown quiet enough to hear it. "But not for your date. I'm doing this because my daughter still believes in me." The laughter that had been hovering at the edge of the room died. Vivian did not move for several seconds. She had never been answered like that. The man in front of her was not trying to win her. He was not even particularly aware of her. He was a father standing inside the gaze of his own child, and it made every other gaze in the room feel small. 3 minutes, she said finally. Her voice was lower than before, almost careful. You have 3 minutes. Elias stepped onto the platform and crossed to the silver-black coupe. He did not pop the hood. He did not call for diagnostic equipment. He did not ask for the engineering reports. Instead, he placed his palm flat against the front fender, just above the headlight, and bent his head as if he were listening to a sleeping animal breathe. A young engineer near the rear of the stage gave a short, sharp laugh. Is he praying? George Bennett did not laugh. George was 58 years old, the chief engineer of Sterling Heritage, and the only member of the technical staff who had personally worked alongside Henry Sterling in the original Long Beach shop. He had watched this stranger touch the car, and he had recognized the posture immediately. It was the posture of a man who had spent thousands of hours with old engines. It was not theater. It was diagnosis. Try the ignition once more, Elias said. But hold the key at the half position before you crank. The engineer looked at Vivian. Vivian nodded. The engineer turned the key, paused, then cranked. This time, in the gap between the half turn and the full crank, a faint hum rose from somewhere beneath the dashboard. It lasted barely a second before cutting out abruptly. Elias opened his eyes. Who replaced the ignition switch but left the original key barrel in place? The technical team stood silent. George Bennett, after a moment, answered. That barrel was Henry Sterling's. We kept it for authenticity. The switch behind it was upgraded last year for reliability. Elias nodded slowly. That is the problem. You're trying to start an old car with new logic. The car does not recognize the sequence. Vivian frowned. Meaning what? He turned toward her, and for the first time he spoke not as a hired hand but as a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. The engine is not dead. The fuel system is not ruined. The ignition is not fully broken. The car is locking itself out. There is an older protective circuit in this design that interrupts fuel flow if the start sequence is not followed in the right order. That is why the auxiliary pump comes on for a second and then shuts down. It is not a failure. It is a refusal. A senior technician on the platform, embarrassed in front of the room, pushed back. We have tested every electrical line in this car. Elias did not raise his voice. You tested what the diagnostic computer can see. But there are things her father built into this car before computers were ever bolted to dashboards. The phrase her father landed harder than he intended. Vivian looked at him with new attention, as if she had only just noticed that his eyes were not the eyes of a part-timer. He knelt beside the driver's footwell and ran his hand along the underside of the dashboard, very slowly, the way a doctor reads a patient's pulse. There is a hidden switch somewhere along here, he said, almost to himself. If I am right, no one in this room has ever found it. Elias drew a small flashlight from his pocket and angled the beam beneath the dashboard. He did not pull anything loose. He traced the wiring harness with 2 fingers, noting the pattern of dust, the small uneven scrapes on the metal lip, the slight discoloration along one painted seam, where, decades ago, a careful hand had matched a custom panel against the factory color. George Bennett stepped closer. He found suddenly that his throat was tight. He remembered something he had not thought about in nearly 20 years. Henry Sterling, in his later years, had grown distrustful of pure electronics. He had been famous for adding mechanical anti-theft devices of his own design to his personal cars. He used to say that a car with a soul ought to have a secret. Vivian heard George breathe in sharply. She did not understand why, until the memory of her own father's voice surfaced unbidden in her mind. She had been 7 years old, standing on the running board of a half-restored coupe, and Henry had set down his wrench and said exactly that. A car with a soul ought to have a secret. She had thought at the time that he was telling a fairy tale. Elias's fingers stopped on a small rectangular panel beneath the steering column, painted to match the dashboard so closely that even in the flashlight beam it almost disappeared. Beneath it, behind a thin, sliding plate, was a small mechanical lever, frozen by 18 years of dried oil and dust. "There," he said softly. He explained, without raising his voice, what the Raven V12 actually required. The car would not start on a single turn of the key. It needed a sequence. Ignition to the half position first, to wake the auxiliary pump. Clutch held all the way down. The hidden lever drawn gently outward to release the secondary fuel valve. A short pause for pressure to build. Only then would the main crank produce ignition. The restoration team had replaced enough modern components that the hidden lever had become jammed in a half position. Every diagnostic they ran reported false errors because the car was functioning exactly as Henry Sterling had designed it to function. It was simply refusing to start for people who did not know how to ask. Vivian stepped down from the platform and approached the open driver's door. She no longer carried herself like a chief executive, issuing instructions. She moved the way a daughter moves when she is suddenly close to something her father once touched. She asked very quietly, "How did you know my father would build it that way?" Elias did not look up. Because men who love old cars do not hide the switch where it is convenient. They hide it where only somebody who is really listening will ever find it. For a long moment Vivian could not speak. It was true of the car. It was, she realized with a slow, unsettling honesty, true of her father. And it was perhaps true of the man kneeling in front of her, whom she had laughed at less than 10 minutes earlier. Elias reached for the lever. Before his fingers could close around it, a sharp voice cut across the platform. "Step away from the dashboard." William Crawford had crossed the room in long strides. His face had the clean, polished calm of a man who knows that the next 30 seconds will decide the shape of a corporation. He did not look at Elias. He looked at Vivian. "You cannot allow an unvetted contractor to disassemble a centerpiece worth nearly $2 million in front of our investors. Whatever happens next becomes your liability." He turned toward Clinton Avery, his voice softening into the tone of a careful host. "Mr. Avery, I apologize for the irregularity of tonight. We will conclude the demonstration here and continue our conversation in private." It was a clean move that would end the gala, the embarrassment, and Vivian's chief executive tenure all in one breath. Vivian looked at Clinton. The investor said nothing, but his expression had shifted into something measuring. He was not judging the car anymore. He was judging her. She turned back toward the Raven. Elias was already withdrawing his hand from the dashboard, slowly, without complaint. He had heard William and understood. He stood up and wiped his fingers on a worn cloth he had drawn from his back pocket. "You have the right to stop me," Elias said, looking at Vivian without challenge. "But if you stop now, this car stays silent. Not because it cannot run, because nobody has been patient enough to listen to it." In her mind, Vivian heard her father's voice again. "Old machines do not shout out their faults. You have to be patient enough to hear them." She looked down at the marble. Matilda was standing very still at the foot of the platform, both small hands clutched around her silver toy car. Her eyes lifted toward her father with the kind of full, uncomplicated belief that had once lived in Vivian's own chest, 20 years ago, in a Long Beach garage that smelled of brake fluid and orange peels. This is not just about a car, Vivian thought with a clarity that surprised her. This is about a child who is waiting for the world to admit her father is who she knows he is. She straightened her shoulders. "Let him finish," she said. William's head snapped around. "Vivian, let him finish, William." Her voice did not rise, but it carried. "I take responsibility." Elias absorbed a moment in silence. He stepped back to the open driver's door and looked at her steadily. "If I am right about this," he said, "you should be the one to start it." The room shifted. The technical staff turned. William opened his mouth and closed it again. "Your father built it," Elias said. "If it is going to make a sound again, the first person to hear it from the driver's seat should be you." Vivian Sterling slid into the driver's seat of the Raven V12. The leather, dry and cracked along the seams, sighed beneath her. The smell that rose from the cabin was the smell of her childhood, of her father's hands, of a workshop floor she had not stood on since she was a girl. Her composure, the polished armor she had worn through every board meeting for 2 years, fell quietly away. Under the showroom lights, she was no longer the chief executive of Sterling Motors Heritage. She was a daughter, sitting behind a wheel her father had once held, hoping that something he had built would still answer her hand. Elias stood at the open door. He did not crowd her. He spoke gently, the way a doctor speaks during a delicate examination. "Turn the key only halfway. Do not crank yet. Wait for the auxiliary pump." She turned the key. The cabin gave a single low hum, no louder than a sleeping cat. "Press the clutch all the way to the floor and hold it." She pressed. "Now reach under the dashboard." "Do you feel the small lever?" Her fingertips, not entirely steady, found the cool brass tab, where his had been a moment before. "Pull it gently. Do not force it. This car does not like being forced." She drew the lever outward by perhaps a quarter of an inch. There was a soft click, almost ceremonial. A few of the guests near the platform stopped breathing. Clint and Avery had quietly moved closer. William Crawford stood unnaturally still, the polite mask on his face beginning to crack. Carter Briggs, who had earlier ordered Elias and Matilda away, stood now with his hands at his sides, looking at the floor. Matilda stood beside George Bennett, gazing up at the open driver's door, her little face lifted in absolute attention. Elias listened. 1 second. 2, dots, 3. Somewhere behind the firewall, fuel pressure rose and steadied. The faint hum settled into a soft, even tone. He nodded once. "Now." Vivian turned the key the rest of the way. For a brief, terrible moment there was only the dry mechanical click of a starter engaging on an old, tired engine. William's mouth almost moved. Clinton's eyes narrowed by a hair. Time stretched like a held breath. And then, low at first, the way a great animal rolls over before it stands, the V12 caught. A deep, throaty rumble rose from the engine bay. It built into a steady, rich, resonant idle, the kind of sound that no factory in the modern world still made, the kind of sound that vintage collectors flew across oceans to hear in person. The chandeliers above the platform trembled faintly with the vibration. The marble seemed, for a moment, to listen. The Sterling Raven V12, after 18 years of silence, was alive. Vivian's hands, still resting on the wheel, began to shake. Her eyes, lifted at the windshield, filled at last. She did not let the tears fall. She did not have to. The whole room saw them. And the whole room understood that the daughter, not the chief executive, had heard her father's car come back to her. She turned her head and looked at Elias through the open driver's door. Her face held no pride and no triumph. It held something simpler and older. Astonishment, gratitude. And beneath those, the quiet, unwelcome beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. For the first several seconds after the engine settled into its idle, no one in the showroom applauded. They did not lack admiration. They lacked breath. The car that 3 engineering teams had failed to start. The car that had nearly cost Sterling Heritage a $90 million investment. That car was now humming under the lights, brought back to life by a mechanic in scuffed boots whom they had laughed at less than 15 minutes earlier. Then the applause began. It started in one corner, near the press line, where a journalist who had been writing a polite obituary for Sterling Heritage now had a different headline to file. It spread outward in a slow wave across the marble. By the time it reached the back of the room, even the older directors who had been allied with William Crawford were clapping out of pure professional reflex. Clinton Avery turned to his assistant and spoke without expression. "Re-prepare the contract. We are proceeding." William Crawford's face went the color of cooled wax. The entire 2-year campaign he had built to force a sale had just unraveled in the space of a single ignition cycle, undone by a man he had described, in a private memo only weeks before, as an unvetted contractor. Carter Briggs took an unconscious step backward. He did not look at Elias. He looked at the floor and discovered, in an unfamiliar way, that he was ashamed. George Bennett did not clap. He stood with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on Elias, and his expression carried a respect that he had not given another man since Henry Sterling had died. But the moment that mattered most in the showroom did not belong to the applause. It belonged to a small girl in a navy coat who had been waiting at the foot of the platform, and who now ran across the marble in 3 bounding steps, and threw her arms around her father's waist. "I knew you could do it, Daddy," Matilda said. Her voice cracked with the held-back tears of a child who had refused to cry in front of strangers. "I knew." Elias knelt and gathered her in. He did not look at the cameras first. He did not look at Vivian first. He did not look at Clinton Avery, whose money would have changed his life, first. He looked at his daughter. He pressed his forehead to her small forehead and breathed once, slowly, the way a man breathes when something inside him that had been bent for a long time is allowed, finally, to straighten. Vivian stepped down from the car. She walked across the platform until she stood directly in front of Elias. The microphone clipped to the lapel of her dress was still active. The whole room would hear what came next, and she did not turn it off. "I was wrong about you," she said. She did not blame the pressure. She did not invoke the board. She did not soften the sentence with a joke for the cameras. "I looked at your clothes before I looked at the man inside them. I am sorry." The room, which had only just recovered enough breath to applaud, fell quiet a second time. It was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet that follows an honest sentence. Elias rose with Matilda still in his arms. He did not gloat. He only nodded once, gently. "Thank you, Miss Sterling." That was all. Within 20 minutes of the engine starting, the gala had transformed from an impending disaster into a triumph. Investors stayed. Clinton Avery's legal team began in a side suite, redrafting the funding agreement with new and more favorable terms. William Crawford left early through a service exit. He would resign within 10 days. Vivian Sterling did not stay to receive congratulations. She slipped away from the press line, asked her assistant to handle the closing remarks, and walked into the back hallway that led from the showroom floor toward the loading dock. She found Elias in the staff corridor, kneeling on one knee, helping Matilda into her coat. He had refused the press and the offered bonus envelope from the event coordinator. He was simply getting his daughter ready to go home. There was no audience here. No marble, no chandeliers, no microphone. Only a service hallway with humming fluorescent lights and the faint, distant rumble of a V12, still idling on the platform. Vivian stopped a few feet away. She had taken off her heels and was carrying them in one hand. She looked, for the first time that night, like a person rather than a brand. "You were going to leave," she said, "without letting me thank you properly." Elias finished buttoning Matilda's coat before he answered. "I did the work I came to do." "No," Vivian said. "You did much more than that. You saved my company, and you did it after I made a fool of you in front of 200 people." He did not punish her for that. He only said, evenly, "You are not the first person to look at my hands instead of my work." The sentence hurt her more than any rebuke he could have crafted, because it told her that her behavior had not been remarkable. It had been ordinary. It had been one more wound in a long row of small wounds, delivered to a man who had borne them all without complaint. "Then let me be the first one to apologize the right way," Vivian said. She offered him a position. A senior consulting role at Sterling Motors Heritage, leading the restoration of the company's most important historic vehicles, with full creative authority and a salary that would let him stop driving from town to town in a service truck. Elias did not answer immediately. He glanced down at Matilda, who was watching the exchange with the wide, careful eyes of a child who has already decided that this woman in the black dress will need to earn her trust, regardless of any car. "My schedule belongs to my daughter," Elias said. "I do not take work that makes me miss her school plays, or her parent-teacher meetings, or her dinners." Vivian crouched until she was level with Matilda. "Then we will build the schedule around her school day," she said. She spoke to Matilda directly, not over her head. "If your daddy works with my company, the work will fit around you, not the other way around." Matilda studied her for a long moment, the way she had studied a strange dog on a sidewalk last summer, before deciding it was friendly. Then, with the sudden honesty that only 6-year-olds possess, she said, "Are you really going to date my dad?" The hallway went very quiet. Elias's mouth twitched, almost into a smile. Vivian, the woman who had handled hostile boardrooms for 2 years without flinching, was caught completely speechless. A faint color crept along her collarbone that no public relations training could have prevented. Elias looked at Vivian, his expression mild, and for the first time that evening, lightly amused. "That was your promise," he said. "Not mine." Vivian rose slowly to her feet. She did not look away. "I am a chief executive," she said. "I do not break promises." A small, surprising sound came out of Elias. It was the closest thing to a laugh he had made in many months. But he did not pretend to fall into the moment, the way a man in a film would fall. "Coffee," he said. "No cameras. No investors. And nobody," he added, glancing once at Matilda's small upturned face, "laughs at my daughter." Vivian nodded. "Agreed." The three of them walked together down the staff corridor toward the parking lot. Behind them, deep in the showroom, the Sterling Raven 512 continued to idle, steady and low and patient, the way a great engine waits when it knows it has finally been heard. To Vivian it was the sound of her father's heritage returning. To Elias it was proof, if his daughter ever needed proof again, that her belief in him had not been wrong. To Matilda, who walked between them holding her toy car in one hand and her father's calloused hand in the other, it was the sound of the night her daddy made a whole room full of people stand up and clap. Between Elias and Vivian, it was not yet love. It was something better suited to a beginning. It was respect, quietly and honestly earned, and it would in time become the foundation of everything that came after.